I'm the program director at the Rowe Conference Center, which is in beautiful Western Massachusetts in New England in the United States. We have been here almost 100 years. Our purpose is to help all people in all ages live flourishing lives. We do that through summer camps for kids and for adults. We do it through weekend workshops on spirituality, personal growth, all the creative arts, nature, and social change. These are all the elements we think go into making for a flourishing life. Until recently, we didn't know that our purpose was to serve people to flourish during a pandemic. But we are doing that. Like you, we've had to make some adjustments in how we do things, and we have moved everything on to Zoom. Actually kicking and screaming because we're all about bringing people together in community, giving them great food, exposing them to wonderful teachers like Sharon, and programs that take place in the beautiful woods of Western Massachusetts. And it seemed impossible to be able to do any of that in 2 dimensions. But we've discovered that there are advantages to doing this. We can now reach all over the world. We can reach much more deeply into our country. We can do programs of various lengths. We can do programs of various price levels. We do quite a lot that is free as well as paid programs. You can see the free programs. We post them, the recordings on our website afterwards, and you're welcome to come look at them and again and to enjoy them and see what else we've got to offer. So I am thrilled and delighted to host Sharon Blackie, who is one.
Arthur, we've got you frozen. I don't know whether you can still see and hear us. Fia, shall we give him a couple of minutes? Otherwise, I'll introduce myself. What would you like to do? Oh, there he is.
Sorry?
Okay, you froze on us.
Oh, okay.
You said my name and then it ended.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, anyway, Sharon. So anyway, Sharon was going to do 2 back-to-back programs with us in May, and now we're able to have her on online. So I want to welcome Sharon. Sharon's going to be speaking to us, I presume, Sharon, from a small holding in the Cambrian Mountains of mid-Wales, where she lives with her husband, her dogs, her hens, and her sheep. Sharon is a PhD and an author. She's a psychologist who's specialized both in neuroscience and narrative, and she's a mythologist with a specialization in Celtic studies. And she's the author of The Long, Delirious, Burning Blue, and If Women Rose Rooted, and The Enchanted Life. And we are thrilled and delighted to have you back online. So thank you, Sharon.
Thank you, Arthur. And yeah, I would just like to say that of all of the places that I have taught in America, not very many of them, but over the past couple of years I've come back, Rowe is my favorite. So I'm really, really sorry that I can't come back to the beautiful forests of Western Massachusetts, where when I was there last, I had a lovely time interacting with chipmunks and trying to figure out what they meant in a kind of mythical and archetypal world. I hadn't really come across much in the way of chipmunks before, but you certainly have them in spades. So I'm sorry I can't come back there right now, but I'm absolutely delighted to be partnering with you guys for this free webinar and for a couple of other things that we will talk about before we close today. So yeah, it is, for those of you who are in America, it is, and other parts of the world, it's 5 p.m. here, which may seem like a reasonable time of the night, but of the day. But when you are awake widely, as I am, at 5 a.m. in the morning, we're going to end very, very close to my bedtime. So I hope you'll forgive me if I look a little bit sleepy at some point. I am engaged and I'm very much looking forward to this, but it's kind of the end of the day for me. So we'll see how we go. So I'd like to begin just by reminding you, just by reading the description for this webinar as an introductory point, and then I'll tell you how I'd like to organize it and what we'd like to do for the little bit of time that we've got together. So it was called Once Upon a Time in the West. And I began with the idea in producing this webinar that our ancestors were wise women, alchemists, oracles, and mages. That our oldest stories tell of shape-shifting, of mysterious and life-changing initiations in dark woods, of intense participation in the web of life. Once upon a time in the West, the smith represented the deepest archetypal magic. The smith, the blacksmith, not the hero, the blacksmith. And the hero gained the greatest gifts by acts of compassion, not of individualism, and certainly not of cutting the heads off dragons. So the West really wasn't always what it is today, and that's really what I want to focus on tonight. Somewhere along the line, and really not very long ago, probably only in the past 200 to 300 years, we lost our way. We lost those threads that I've just mentioned. So what I'm interested in, and I guess the focus of all of my work, whether it's writing or running courses and workshops, is on how we pick up those dropped threads again, how we follow the trail of breadcrumbs out of the dark woods that we seem to have lost ourselves in, and how we carry our ancient native traditions forward into a new and ever more challenging world. And it certainly is that at the moment, isn't it? So there are really two threads that I'd like to work with this evening. First of all, what is that history? When I say the West was different, what are some actual examples of that? And secondly, how can we reclaim some of those old threads in a way that fits a world which is very, very different now from the world that our ancestors inhabited? So I'm going to talk here for a little while, and then we're going to have a discussion. I'm going to pose you a question, and we will have a discussion on chat. Please, everybody, again, stay muted if you don't mind. We have so many people here signed up that we're not going to be able to do kind of like, face-to-face questions, spoken questions. We're going to use the chat box. And then I'm going to talk for a little bit longer in the second session, and then we're going to have another discussion period. So we'll break it up and you're not just looking at my face all the time talking away. If you are asking any questions on chat while I'm talking, with many apologies, I'm really bad at doing two things at once. It's a function of increasing age. So while I'm talking, I'm not really going to be able to follow the chat. But if you have any questions, I'm sure our hosts, technical questions or whatever, I'm sure our hosts will be able to help you out. So the West today, we do see it, I think, as disconnected and as degraded. And we have a tendency, all of us in the countries that most of us come from, to look either to the East or perhaps further west, to the Native American traditions, Native Canadian traditions, for example, for inspiration, to cultures other than our own, which seem to live more in balance and harmony with the earth, and which seem more to focus on the development of the individual as a kind of soul journey, as a journey of meaning through this life. But the thing is, and again, this is my passion to make people more aware of this, we come from such a culture ourselves. You don't have to look all that far back to see that. It is those same ideas are in our lineage, they are in our ancestry, and it's really not so long ago that we lost them. So that is what I'd like to think about this evening, that a key truth which we have, most of us, forgotten, is that the old pre-biblical, let's say pre-Christian mythologies and philosophies of the West are very rich and very complex and very beautiful. And they offer up a world in which everything is not only alive, but has a purpose, a kind of intentionality of its own, and a world in which each incarnated soul chooses to come for a reason and bearing a gift which only it can express, only he or she can express through relationship with this beautiful animate world that we choose to be born into. So we come carrying an image, carrying a kind of fire that we are born with, that we brought with us when we chose to come into this world, knowing that there are other layers of reality from just the physical world that we see with our senses, important as that is, and others who come to us archetypes, psychopomps, that beautiful old Greek word for soul guide, who appear to us in dreams, in stories and myth and in images, and who will help and guide us if we only know how to find them and how to properly listen. But that act of finding, of listening, of even knowing that all of this is there is precisely what we've kind of lost track of over the years. And some of our most profound myths and stories have been relegated to kind of entertainment for kids, rather than, as they might be in other indigenous cultures, teaching stories or ways of guiding us through our life. So really over the centuries, probably for the past 2,000 years, but particularly over the past 200 or 300 years, this older knowledge, this older and very much wilder mythology has been usually deliberately overwritten. And it's my belief that we badly need to find a way back to it, that we need to find our mythic ground again. We need to find a way of reminding ourselves who we are, why we're here, of falling in love again with this earth, and to find a genuine sense of deeply embodied belonging to it. And to remember, as Carl Jung once said, that we as humans are myth makers, we are story keepers, story makers. We're kind of made to challenge the stories and the myths that we live by and to think about them very deeply. And if they don't work, to find a way of making new ones that do work. And that is something which is core to us that I think we tend again to have forgotten today. We tend to be swept away by the prevailing cultural mythology, even when it's dysfunctional, and we forget that that power lies in us. So these are the threads that we'll be looking at in brief today. I'd like to begin by outlining just a few of those old traditions and those old ideas. The West is a big place. Obviously, we have many traditions, from the classical kind of Greek and Roman traditions through to the Celtic traditions of my native countries, to the Scandinavian traditions and influences from other places. And we couldn't possibly go through all of them today. So I just want to offer you a kind of just a few of them, just a little bit of inspiration. I can't go into great detail on any of them. The good news, though, is that in 2021, as well as partnering with wonderful organizations like Row, I will be launching a series of online salons on my own website in which we go through these things, so there'll be ample opportunity to explore them in more detail at some other point. So let's just take a little bit of a walk through some of that history now and have a discussion about what most inspires us about them before we move on to thinking about how we can reintroduce some of those ideas into our lives today. So the first idea that I'd like to seed with you is that in the native traditions of the West, and here I'm going to specifically focus on ancient Greece, which influenced so much of Western culture profoundly in more ways than I can tell you, and to talk about a fundamental belief in the classical Greek system, which is that we as individual souls came here by choice, chose to be physically incarnated into a body in this place in a particular set of circumstances in order to offer up a unique gift to the world that only we could offer, to offer our uniqueness to a world at whatever stage it was, for a purpose. And so I guess the message is that however appalling and difficult and challenging it seems to us right now, by this old philosophy, which is part of our heritage in the West, we chose to be here, even in these challenging and difficult times. And then the question remains, of course, how do we best make use of this opportunity, not just to carry on and do the best we can on our own individual soul journey, but to offer the best that we can to a world which is animate and which is in its own process of becoming. So, as I say, Plato said each soul chooses to come here. We don't see that in the world today, that idea. Perhaps in some religions there is some element of it, but not really that sense of a deep sense of service, both to ourselves as individual souls and to the world at the same time. And that's one of the reasons why there is such a profound loss of meaning here in the West, that we do not see that as the reason why we are here. More often than not, we don't know why we're here, or a vast majority of the population thinks that we're just here by accident and for no purpose. So our oldest mythologies, our oldest philosophies would tell us differently. And that to me is kind of the starting point for everything that I teach, everything that I believe, that we are not here by accident, that we chose to be here, that we need to find that unique gift that we came to the world with. We need to find that sense of calling and do our best to be what we were always intended to be. So that is the key element, I would say, in most of the Western traditions that I have studied. Sometimes it's a little bit hidden, but in the ancient Greek world, it is absolutely profoundly there from the beginning. Tied up with that notion that we as souls chose to come here, to be incarnated into this physical body, to be embodied on this earth, is the idea that goes along with that, that everything else around us is alive and has intentionality and is also on its own soul journey, is also here for a reason. A tree, a rock, the planet, the cosmos, all have their own purpose, just as we have a purpose. And we play a role in that unfolding, as well as in our own individual journeys unfolding. So from Plato to Plotinus to Aristotle, all of names hopefully you'll be familiar with, ancient Greek philosophers believed that the cosmos was brought into being and is animated by a collective soul which joins all things, all phenomena, all beings together. That is our heritage. It's not just something that belongs to other cultures, to indigenous cultures. That is our ancient belief, our lineage here in the West. And that notion of everything being animated, of being pervaded with soul, really is the underlying principle of reality. So the entire universe in this worldview is a living organism, and all levels of being are linked together in it in an unbreakable chain. And Plotinus, who is a Greek philosopher who came after Plato, believed that our task in life, in being incarnated here, is to awaken to, and I quote here somewhere, another way of seeing which everyone has but few use. So to understand this notion of an ensouled world endowed with purpose is part of our ancestral lineage, and it's part of countless native traditions throughout Europe. And Plato said it very clearly. I just want to offer you this one quote from Plato. Here's what he said. "The world is indeed a living being endowed with a soul and intelligence, a single, visible, living entity containing all other living entities, which by their nature are all related." Now, Plato called this world, excuse me a moment, Plato called this world soul, the world soul, the anima mundi. Anima mundi, literally the soul of the world. And he wrote that the creator of the universe, as he thought of it, infused soul throughout the cosmos and so made this living ensouled universe. So in other words, The soul of the world is immanent in physical matter. It's not up there, it's not transcendent, it's not something separate from us. It is in this physical world, just as traditional cultures all around the world imagine it. We are no different in that. Soul is present in all matter. And later, Aristotle went on to suggest that the cosmos itself is in a flow of becoming. It has its own journey of transformation, and that we, along with all other than human beings, trees, rocks, animals, whatever, are a critical and necessary part of that ongoing growth and transformation of the cosmos. So basically, every one of us is here to offer up a part in that unfolding, in that process of becoming. Another thread which runs through this is the importance of the imagination in all of this. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that because it's really important to the work that I do and to the way that I think we can help ourselves pick up some of these threads and some of these pieces and make them part of our daily practice today. And I guess, you know, when I was a kid, as most children do, I very much inhabited an imaginal world. The products of my imagination really were created from the physical and sensory world around me. But really at a very early age, I understood just how profoundly we've come to devalue imagination in the West, that, you know, that is seen even in children today as escaping into a fantasy world, is not real. Some things apparently are allowed to be real while others aren't. And it's really thought of very much as kind of escapism. But throughout our history in the West, all the way through till the era of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, the imaginal world, the imagination, has always been held to be as real as any other. Not to be something made up, but actually to constitute a real world in which stuff happens that impacts us. Until the Reformation, medieval culture in Western Europe was characterized by all kinds of contemplative practices which depended on employing the imagination. And at the heart of all of those contemplative practices was a belief that employing the imagination, engaging with the imagination, somehow connects us to the divine, somehow connects us to the soul of the world, somehow connects us to all of these other levels of reality which exist beyond the purely physical. So they would have been perfectly standard practices, in the same way that we see, you know, Buddhist, Tantric, Hindu, Taoist practices in the East today, let's say. These would have been part of our Western practices too. It's just that they fell by the wayside as we fell in love with scientism and rationalism and intellectualism. So that purposeful engagement with the imaginal world is now quite rare here today in the West. And cutting us off from that, ourselves from that, and relegating the powerful act of imagining to me a daydreaming or fantasizing, has meant that we have again lost a sense of meaning, lost a sense of there being anything in the world beyond us as human beings. And that's a fairly lonely place to be in the universe. So again, I'm very passionate about us kind of pulling that apart, unpicking that idea and coming back to the idea of the imaginal world. The best way that I can give you a picture of what I mean by the imaginal world is actually to move a little bit further east, out of the West, a little bit further east into the ancient Sufi tradition. And those of you who've done my courses or heard me speak before will know this, so bear with me while I repeat myself. For those who aren't familiar with this, and to go to the Sufi tradition, which is the mystical branch of Islam and has a long and very beautiful history. And Henri Corbin, who was a 20th century French philosopher and student of the ancient Sufi traditions, used the term mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world, to describe a particular order of reality which is referred to in ancient Sufi texts. And these texts tell us that between the physical world of our senses and the kind of world of abstract intellect, which we imagine usually sits inside our heads, lies another world. So there's a middle world, if you like, and this is the mundus imaginalis, the world of the image. And this world of the image is just as real as the other two, which it's kind of sandwiched in between. It has an independent existence. The mundus imaginalis, in that old view, and we see threads of this in ancient Greek history as well, it's just easier to describe it from the Sufi perspective, is the place that all spiritual and transcendent experience comes from. It's the source of synchronicities, of kind of psychic experiences, of creative insights. It penetrates into our dreams and other visionary experiences. It is a place where story lives. We think we make stories up. According to this perspective, we don't make stories up. They have an independent existence, and if we're very lucky, they happen to us. It is a place where archetypes live, what Jung called archetypes, beings, ideas. Plato called them ideas or forms. Archetypes would be characters, the archetypal energies and beings that sometimes we've called gods or angels or soul guides, who again penetrate into our dreams, occur in stories and myths, and are there to guide us, to lead us, to show us insights, offer us insights into the way the world is if we choose to look at them. So again, this idea of an imaginal world, which is another layer of reality which penetrates the physical and sensory world, is very much part of other traditions here in the West. So if we move for a moment to the part of the world where I am speaking from, to Wales, to Ireland and other Celtic countries, we see the imaginal world, the mundus imaginalis, reflected very clearly in the concept of the other world. And I've always said that in these countries, in Ireland and Scotland and Wales, the places that I belong to, we walk with one foot in the other world. There is a knowledge, there is still that hereditary knowledge that the other world exists, that it is real, that it is enfolded with this one, into this one, that it cannot be extracted from it, that it cannot be separated from it, that it impacts this one in very, very many ways, that it has a kind of moral authority which penetrates into this physical world. It is fundamental to the Celtic belief systems that we know about very clearly, this belief in at least one alternate layer of reality which contains beings, stories, in which we can adventure sometimes if we're lucky enough to go there, which impact our lives and our world significantly. So this again is part of our heritage, but again it has been pretty much relegated, downgraded to some funny fairyland in stories for kids, and that wasn't what it was at all. It was a really important intrinsic part of our cosmology. Talking about myth and story, that's another important thread in our lineage, the importance of myth and story. And this idea, this very important notion, again, that we do not make them up any more than we make dreams up. We have become intensely human-centered, particularly over the past couple of centuries. And, you know, I studied as a psychologist back in my youth. That was my first ology. I've gained a few other ologies since then. That was my first ology. And I very soon became disenchanted with modern psychology because its entire purpose seems to be to lock us up inside our own heads, to put us at the center of the universe, to say, you know, the dreams are aspects of our character, of our soul, rather, of our unconscious, that characters in story are aspects of our psyche, that if there is a female character, it's our anima, that if there is a male character, it's our animus. And by the ancient traditions, this is just nonsense. The standard Jungian analysis of dreams and fairy tale just wouldn't hold water. These myths and stories contained archetypal themes, threads, beings, characters that had an independent existence and that were acting upon us, happening to us, that came from the mundus imaginalis, the other world. They're not part of us. It's not all about us in our old traditions. It's much more interesting than that. And I find it very dull, this idea that it all comes from us, you know, that we make our own dreams up, we make the stories up. It just, apart from the fact that's just that's a personal preference, of course, but the old traditions tell us that that is not how it is, that we are part of a web and there are other beings and other creatures in it which influence us. So myth and story really in our old traditions are more than just teaching tales. They contain, it's as if they contain the building blocks of reality. They contain information, they contain guidance, they contain ways of reimagining the world. They help us to reimagine the world when it needs to be reimagined. We certainly need to reimagine it now, right? And to reimagine, if necessary, our place in it. They help us to perceive, to explain, to make sense of the world. And this is an intensely important function. One of the examples of that I'd like to offer briefly is a series of legends, myths, bit of fairy tale thrown in there too, which when taken together have been called one of the foundational mythologies, possibly the foundational mythology of the West, and that is the body of law related to the Grail, which only later became Christianized and became the Holy Grail. Once upon a time it wasn't so holy and it wasn't so Christian. The Grail stories are a very, and I don't have any time to go into them in great detail now, but just to sow a seed for the future perhaps. The Grail stories are a kind of antidote to the kind of Joseph Campbell-esque hero's journey, which I don't have a great deal of fondness for, which is profoundly individualistic, which is very linear, which is very active, which is about cutting the heads off dragons and fighting battles and all of that kind of nonsense. The Grail story, the Grail hero, if we must call him a hero, to use a term that we're probably all familiar with, overcomes or grows, gains in wisdom, brings a gift back to the world through compassion, through joining together in community. It's an example of what I call the post-heroic journey. Although the hero may be male in those stories, the Grail, which is kind of a vessel, which if you want to think of it, in the older stories, contains the anima mundi, is kind of contains the life-giving force of the other world. That's what was lost in the oldest stories. The Grail is always held by women. Women are the Grail keepers, they are the Grail bearers, they are the Grail messengers. So whereas in many stories that we have come to know later, many myths and stories which are very hero-centered, very male-centered, in these older stories from our Western traditions, the female is absolutely critical. And the role of the feminine would be the next thread that I would highlight to you from these old traditions. Women, we see it in the power of the witch archetype, and I'm not going to talk about that today because there is a course coming up again through the Rose Centre where I'm going to look at the witch archetype in a great deal of detail and what it means to us as women today, particularly now more than ever, I think. Women were oracles, seers, prophetesses. They were the ones who could access and pass on the wisdom of the other world. They were messengers. They were more than that. in the Celtic traditions, certainly in the Irish tradition, very, very strongly, they were bearers, if you like, of the moral authority of the other world. They chose the appropriate kings, they chose the appropriate heroes for whatever job was necessary at the time, for whatever the world was facing. They knew how to make it work. Women, again, if those of you who've read, as those of you who've read my book, If Women Rose Rooted, will know very clearly, women in our ancient Celtic and British traditions were guardians and protectors of the land. They were the land personified. So in contrast to a tradition, a Western tradition, which has increasingly become stripped of the feminine, the oldest stories offer us up a cosmology in which the female really was very much at the center. Now, that's not to say that the female replaced the male. What we had was a very, very clear sense of balance between masculine and female energies in cosmology, in the world. But the role of the feminine was profound and fascinating and very, very beautiful. And again, I'm going to be exploring this in some workshops at the beginning of 2021. So if this particular aspect of our ancient traditions interests you, do have a peek at my website, sign up to my newsletter and be kept informed, because there is so much to unpack in that, so much depth, so much beauty, so much that can serve as meaningful and important role models for women at this very, very challenging time for the planet. And I think it's really, really important that we look back at these old stories. We see what threads we can bring forward again into a world that is very, very different. There is a whole set of traditions which, again, we don't have very much time to go into in detail, because I want to open up in a moment for a little bit of a discussion around some of these ideas. But there's a whole area of, don't really know what to call it, thought, philosophy, practice, spirituality, which is known under numerous names, but generally is thought of as either the Western mystery tradition or the Western esoteric tradition. And the following practices, belief systems, traditions are usually considered, they're all lumped in together, a quite disparate bunch of things, all lumped in together as part of what I prefer to call the Western mystery tradition, which kind of incorporates some bits from Greece, from Egypt, from Scandinavia, from the Celtic traditions. It's kind of a Western mishmash, if you like, of various threads and traditions that were important in the West in the past 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years. So it includes things like alchemy, a whole other subject, very, very big subject, haven't got time to go there. Astrology, again, a big subject. Herbalism, tarot, and other forms of divination. Gnosticism is a part of it. Hermeticism, I'm not going to define all this for you, otherwise we'll be here all night, but I just want to give you some clues if you want to go away and research for yourselves. Numerology, in the Jewish tradition, Kabbalah would be considered to be part of the Western mystery tradition. Ritual or ceremonial magic, the group of societies, thought processes that includes Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and all of that kind of thing. So you have all of this disparate group of practices and ideas which are called the Western mystery tradition. And it was probably around the late 17th century that a group of Western philosophers and thinkers thought that they could all be kept meaningfully, not just, you know, put into a shopping bag for no good reason, but that they could be meaningfully categorized together. And there is a historian of religion called Henrik Bogdan who suggested that the Western mystery tradition constituted what he called a third pillar of Western culture, alongside doctrinal faith like Christianity, for example, or rationality, the kind of enlightenment view. So he said there was the enlightenment, which really, didn't believe in anything very much other than science, technology, the intellect, and so on. Then there was kind of formal, dogma-driven religion, and somewhere else not recognized as much, because a lot of it, of course, went underground for various reasons from the Inquisition in the medieval period onward. Then there was this third branch, which constituted the Western mystery tradition and all of those wonderful and fascinating and rich traditions like alchemy, tarot, and all of the other things that I have mentioned. And beyond, fundamental to the Western mystery tradition, we come back to this idea that behind or between the physical and intellectual worlds is this deeper, spiritual, imaginal, soul-filled world, which represents, if you like, the kind of creative, generative life force essence of the cosmos, and that the practices which these traditions employ are ways of engaging with that life force of the cosmos, ways of engaging with what Plato called the anima mundi, ways of what I call courting the world soul. And all of those experiences, mystical experiences, really are the kind of revelation of the nature of that sacred ground. So that is, to begin with this evening, that's a whistle-stop tour, a real whistle-stop tour, and it's not even a full whistle-stop tour. We haven't got everything in it, but that's a tour of the kinds of ideas that are part of what really is, if you look at it all, and there's a lot to synthesize. This is not a quick piece of work. I've been studying this stuff for decades now. If you piece it all together, though, is really a very consistent perspective that I believe, and I'll argue kind of when we come back to the second session after a bit of discussion, really constitutes a very beautiful, a very meaningful, and a very purposeful perspective on the world that pervades all of our individual traditions here in the West. That is our lineage. The Enlightenment is not our lineage. Disenchantment is not our ancestry. These are newfangled ideas that really have only happened in the past 200 or 300 years. Of course, there has been a build-up over the past couple of millennia. I don't want to oversimplify here, but our tradition is very, very different, and yet somehow we rarely think of it as a kind of cosmology, excuse me, as a way of being in the world, as a spirituality. We tend to see it as ideas, kind of on a shelf, books that we can pick up and we can explore. Whereas in any other culture, these ideas are ways of being in the world, ways of living in the world, ways of inhabiting the world, of interacting and being in reciprocal relationship with this earth and with the other than humans which occupy it along with us. So what I would like to do in a moment is just think of some of the ways in which we can start to draw these disparate, very, very old threads together, which were created in a very, very different world, and how we can make them relevant without being regressive, without trying to go back to some golden age which probably never existed, without trying to recreate a world which cannot exist now. How can we pick up some of those threads again today in order to create a deeper sense of meaning, a deeper sense of relationship, and a deeper sense of purpose, for not just for our own lives, but for the world around us? So let us take a wee break from just hearing me talk. And there are quite a few of you here. The chat is going to move really, really quickly, and I'm going to find it difficult to keep up. And I just want to take maybe 10 minutes or so to to have a discussion, but if anybody has a thought on specifically, I guess, what inspires you, rather than a question. Let's hold off on specific questions on the detail of what I've said now, because again, we could be here all night. What I'm interested in is what inspires you about that lineage that I've been talking about, and what makes you skeptical about it. Is there anything that makes you skeptical? So kind of like bigger picture questions rather than on the detail of the ideas that I've been talking about. Please again use the chat. We don't unfortunately have time to go to live calls, and I'll try and keep up as much as I can. Amanda, I'm inspired by the connection to nature, and yeah, that really is utterly at the heart of it. And I was always struck when I first began to delve into this, that, you know, again, I had thought that that belonged to other cultures, that it was Native Americans, it was Taoists, you know, it was others who were deeply connected to the natural world, not us. But the entire foundations of Western culture were also founded on this deep sense of choosing to be embodied. We chose to come here in a physical body. We're not, you know, whereas Christianity and other religions told us that we had to supersede the physical body, that it was something to get over. And some, like Gnosticism, for example, the physical body is actively evil, that this is something we must get over in order to transcend ourselves. Absolutely the opposite of what our ancient traditions would argue, that we chose to come here to be physically incarnated because there are some things that we can only learn and that we can only grow in a physical incarnation. And that means being physically connected to the rest of the world around us and the beings that inhabit it alongside us. So yes, the connection to nature is really, really important. Charlene, what inspires you is that we can bring this back and apply it. Yes, I hope so. The first trick to me is to understand that we have it. You know, that we don't have to go borrowing from other traditions, wonderful as they are, and much as we may want to borrow some things. I'm not suggesting that we don't borrow if we think that other traditions offer us as individuals something important. But I think we have to do that from a sense of belonging to our own lineage, belonging to understanding that our ancestors, that we are part of a line of this kind of thought, that we're not just plonked here, you know, some kind of intellectualized accidents, but that we come too from this tradition. It's just that we lost our threads in ways that some other indigenous traditions didn't. But there is always the possibility of picking them up again. Erica, I'm inspired at the possibility of something not so patriarchal. Yes. And again, you know, there are all kinds of threads from all over Europe showing us how important the feminine was in our ancient cosmology. In Ireland, which is probably the place that I have studied more, although I'm very much familiar with the mythology of other European cultures too. But in Ireland, the cosmology is profoundly female-centered. It really is. Males have a very important role too. Again, none of this is one-sided, but the center of the creative, generative universe is female. And we really, really badly need to remember that, because we need that creative, generative power, whether it is shown in men or in women. We need to believe that that is important. We need to believe it's part of our inheritance, and we need to find ways of bringing it forward into our world today. I'm inspired, Rosalind Fay, I'm inspired by these ways to step back into the wider web, into the circle. Life suddenly feels so much more rich and less lonely and isolated. And, you know, I think that was an important thing for me too, when I first really began to piece all of this work together, which is that if you really do believe that you chose to come here to be part of an animate earth, to be part of a web of life, that not just through connecting to the other than humans who inhabit this physical sensory earth with us, talk to crows all the time. I'm sure many of you have your your favorite trees, rocks, stones, birds, animals to talk to. Um, but also that sense of there being the imaginal world full of myths and stories and archetypal beings to interact with. It's not that you wouldn't be lonely for human company if you find it difficult to obtain it, but there is that sense of not really being alone at all, and that sense of really belonging here because you chose to come here for a purpose. Even if we lose our way, and we all lose our way, again, in Women Is Rooted in particular, I talked in great detail about the many ways in which I lost mine over many, many decades until I kind of found it again. It's part of the point, I suspect, but that's a story for another day. We all lose our way, but there are guideposts there at all levels, in the physical world, in the imaginal world, all around us, if we choose to see them. And yeah, it's very difficult to feel alone under those circumstances. Lynn, I'm a herbalist, and learning my ancestors' herbal traditions inspire me. I want to feel more connected to that medicine. Yes, within everything that I have been talking about, there are some very specific traditions, some very specific knowledge that is there for the taking. We just have to, I guess, persuade the culture to value it more, persuade ourselves to value it more, to study it, but also to persuade the culture to value it more. But then the responsibility, I think, lies with us. If that is your passion, how can you convey that passion? How can you offer to other people a way of being in the world that is rich because of that, so that we help them to want it too? One of the things that I learned as a psychologist, and I've learned in everything I've studied throughout my life, is that in order to create change in people, we have to capture their imagination. Absolutely have to capture their imagination. And, you know, again, it's a whole story for another day, but I think that's one of the reasons why the environmental movement is finding it difficult to gain traction with certain swathes of the population, because it's very much about, you have to give this up, you have to give that up, you have to change, you can't do this anymore. Whereas to me, if you can inspire people to live differently by, I guess, demonstrating to them by the power of your own passion, by the power of your own life, that there is joy here and meaning here and purpose here that is not to be found in the cultural grind, then that's how you make people want it. That's how you help people to change. So yes, herbalism, whatever it may be, let's show people that there is value, meaning and purpose here. And then I think we begin to change the world in that way, kind of from the bottom up. Colleen, feel inspired by a deeper sense of belonging. Exactly. And Anne, inspired by an existence that's not centralized around the human existence. Indeed, we are, in all of these traditions, humans are a critically important part of this, but so are other beings too. So the good news is we don't have to think that we're irrelevant in any of this. We are part of the universe's unfolding, just as other beings are, but we are part of it. We have a job and a responsibility and moral obligation, if you like, to ourselves and to the unfolding cosmos. And that's a very beautiful thing, if we can find out what our little piece of the puzzle is. Anastasia Rose, inspired that we can reimagine this world. Yes, that's it. It all begins with the act of imagining. And the act of imagining in these old traditions is an act of power. And by that, I don't mean at all in some new agey thing that you can just manifest whatever you want to into being just by, saying a mantra a few times a day. I think that's absolute nonsense. Another story for another day. But the act of imagining, if it's done in a reciprocal relationship with the world, if it is done as an act of relationship, as an act of conversation with the world, rather than as an act of imposing our will on the world or trying to do something to the world, the act of imagining as an act of relationship is an act of co-creation. And That is why it is so important. But it is not the kind of power over idea that we have grown up with, you know, that we do something to the world. It is very much about engaging the world. Just one little example, which I use all the time, but I love it because it's a very important one. In the Irish and Scottish herbal traditions, some of you again who've heard me speak about this will know, the giving of a plant was never enough. The plant was important, the properties of the plant were important. If you were trying to affect change, if you were trying to heal a person, the plant was only part of it, the actual physical properties of the plant. You had to enter into relationship with the plant and persuade it to help you heal the person that you were trying to help. So any act of giving a herb was accompanied by the saying of a charm or an invocation. And these charms and invocations normally began with telling the plant how absolutely beautiful it was, how wonderful it was, what amazing properties it had, and how you really, really, really would appreciate its help. You didn't just plonk the herb in the person and just assume that it would do whatever you wanted it to. You engaged in a relationship, in a conversation with the plant. You recognized that it had its own way of being in the world, and you asked it if it would help. And that act of reciprocity, which in the Native American tradition, Robin Wall Kimmerer writes so beautifully about in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, the act of reciprocity is absolutely fundamental to our traditions as well. You don't go blundering in, you ask. And that's really, really important. I can't for the life of me remember how I got into that, but I'm sure there was a way in. And willingness to be guided. Yes, that sense of openness to, careful openness, you know, caution. We all have to be cautious in these things, but openness to look for guidance, to look for inspiration, to be open to the possibility of it, which is the key trick here, isn't it? To believe that it actually exists as a possibility. What else have we got here? Skeptical, Anne. Skeptical because there is so much New Age malarkey. Yes, there is. There's a lot of stuff out there which takes this to what I think of as quite pernicious limits. Yeah. Again, and I would say that, and forgive me if I offend anybody here, but I like to be honest about these things. The kind of way of looking at the world that is perpetrated in books like The Secret, to me, is anathema. That is not how this works. Again, you know, that's a sense of power over, that you can have whatever you want if you want it hard enough. That isn't how it works. There is, for example, there is also in the Greek tradition this very interesting concept of fate. Now, fate is often misunderstood in the Greek tradition. People think of it as destiny, okay? So, you know, you're fated. The gods tell you what your life is going to be like, and you have no choice. And, you know, all the greatest Greek tragedies are normally interpreted as the hero couldn't help it. You know, it was his fate to run off with his mother, or it was his fate to, you know, to want something that he couldn't have, and it was always going to happen and he couldn't change it. That's not actually how the Greek concept of fate worked. In the oldest philosophies, fate was a balancer. Fate was the natural balance of the world. So if someone took more than their share, if someone did not act in a reciprocal way, if someone wanted power that was not for him, you know, that would take power away from somebody else, if someone wanted his mother that he may not have, then fate stepped in to balance, because the idea was that one person's poor choices, one person's excess of power, one person taking too much for themselves, threw the entire universe a little bit out of balance, and it had to be balanced back so that everybody else could, you know, could do their bit and play their part. So fate was never destiny in the way that we think of it as, predetermined. Fate was a balancer. And I think what is interesting, it had consequences, in other words. Consequences, I love consequences in stories and all kinds of things. It's not all nice out there. if you took too much, there were consequences for you because the balance had to be brought back. We see this profoundly in the Irish tradition as well, but again, that's a story for another day. So these ideas that everybody can have everything they want just by wishing for it would have been complete anathema to our ancestors, because they knew that that wasn't the way that the world worked, that everything had to be kept in balance, and that was where fate came in as the great balancer. So I think there are antidotes to what, Anne, you beautifully call the New Age malarkey. We have to be grounded. We have to be grounded. And the thing that I'm passionate about, and I'll come back to it in the next session, is that there is a risk of intellectualizing and abstracting and transcendentalizing a lot of these ideas. And that is one of the things that's happened over the centuries. What we have to do is bring the imagination back down to earth. We have to ground ourselves in this beautiful planet, in the places that we live in our own bodies. And then somehow that's the kind of, if we do that well, they're kind of our checkpoints. There are balances. There are a little kind of like piece of local fate. So I think there are antidotes, but yeah, you're quite right. A couple more and then we'll move on. Mariana, I'm inspired by the knowing that I'm part of an ancient lineage that is deeply rooted in reverence for this living earth, and that I too, as my people before me, can live a life that is deeply reciprocal and sacred. And Carla, inspired by the fact that this is so hopeful in a time when things often seem not. So yes, exactly. That's what keeps me going every day. There are many, many things to be said about this concept of why we're here, why we chose to come here, that ancient concept of calling. But again, that would take way too long. But that sense that, to go into detail here, but that sense that we came here to display a gift does not entrain the idea that we came here to save the world or anybody or to do big, grandiose feats. It's just that we came here to offer a gift to the world at this time, in this place, which is needed. And the beauty of that, if you really believe in that, is that we're not the ones that get to judge whether what we do is good enough. And so there's kind of a loss of attachment to outcome. I don't mean in any way that you don't care, but just that you'll never know what difference you make by showing up, by being in the world, by being all that you can be. If it's a beautiful gardener, a brilliant herbalist, if it's a storyteller, if it's someone who knits beautiful, it doesn't matter. This is not grandiose stuff. For some people it is, but not for all of us. It's just a way of offering. The Greeks would have seen it as offering beauty to the world, offering beauty to the world, to keep beauty alive, to keep the imaginal world alive, to keep the world soul singing. That's what each of us is here to do. And we have to believe that's enough, because we don't get to judge in this life. Okay, so thank you all for those comments. Carrie, can I give some practical ways, examples of how we can integrate these ways of being in the world into our modern contemporary lives? A little bit. I mean, again, we don't have very much time tonight, and this is a huge subject which I cover in probably in other courses and other writings, books and what have you, but I'm going to move on to think a little bit about that, and then we have another discussion about it and what you all think for the remainder of the evening. We've got until no later than 7 p.m. UK time, which is 2 p.m. Eastern time, and whatever else it is wherever you are. I don't know, so we've got a little bit of time left. So we're talking about these ancient ideas, and when I say ancient, gosh, I don't know, we're looking at, and some of the ancient Greek stuff, we'd be looking at 4,000 to 3,000 years ago, let's say, when a lot of this stuff was written down, but it would have existed in the tradition before it was written down, in the oral tradition. So ancient, thousands of years old ideas. And it is important, whilst seeing the beauty of that lineage, it's important to accept, to be able to accept, that the world has changed in 2000 years. In many ways, we know less than our ancestors did. We've lost a lot of wisdom. But in other ways, we know more. Some good stuff and some bad stuff. But the world, we know more about certain parts of the world. Culture has changed. Society has changed. We read different things. We see things differently. We have a different concept of the cosmos, which has to be brought in somehow to these ideas, and we have to allow them to grow. And the key part of the work that I think is important to do from this is not to employ the same static dogma, the same dogmatic approach which got us into this mess in the first place. One of my favorite books, and again, I talk about this quite a lot, so forgive me again for those of you who've heard me repeat myself. One of my favorite novels is Ceremony by Leslie Malman Silko, wonderful Native American writer. In Ceremony, she has a medicine, it's a very short version, a medicine man called Bettany, who explains to the people, to his people, that the ceremonies have to change and grow. You can't keep them static. You can't keep them what they were 200 years ago. You have to allow them to change and to transform, partly because they have their own journey. We have no right to keep them static, but really because if they don't change and grow, they'll die. And the same applies to story. The same applies to the kind of traditions that we are talking about. All of this work that all of these ideas that I've been talking about are premised on the idea that everything is in a process of becoming and growing and transforming, not just us, stories too. It's no good keeping stories static. They have to evolve. It's no good keeping a particular deity, I don't know, I can't think of any examples. No good keeping them what they were 2,000 years ago. The world has changed. They would be irrelevant. We have to allow for the process of becoming of the rest of the world as well as us. We have a tendency to think that humans are the only ones that are supposed to grow and change and transform. No, everything is supposed to. So I tend not to be a fan of reconstructionist approaches, where we go back and we try to reconstruct in great detail the specific practices and the ceremonies, even the rituals of our ancestors, partly because, frankly, we do not, whatever anybody tells you, we do not mostly have the knowledge to do that with, but also because the world is a little bit different. And yet these core ideas, that core sense of meaning and purpose, of embeddedness in an animate universe, that we can bring forward into today's world in a really, really, again, grounded and authentic way. The key part of this is to step out of dogma and into what would be, or the term for it would be personal gnosis. That's Gnosis, a kind of gnosis, meaning knowing at a very, very deep level. And so all of this work would say, not that you shouldn't, think of spiritual practices in community, but that at some level you as an individual soul have to be tuned in to your own wisdom, to your own knowledge. You have to be responsible for your own interaction with the world, with the physical world and with the imaginal world, that it can't be done for you by a third party, for example. You have to go there. That it is a personal set of revelations, And again, when I say that, I don't mean individualistic and not community-centered, but that the responsibility for knowledge, for growth, for transformation, for seeking knowledge and wisdom and the truth, whatever that may be, lies with you as an individual, that it isn't something that should be handed down in 2,000-year-old dogma or whatever, that the responsibility is very, very much more on us. And again, Carl Jung wrote a lot about this in the context of spirituality and how important it is for each of us to have that sense of responsibility for our own knowledge, for our own revelation, if you like, in order not to be too drawn away into the delusions of the masses, as he put it. And I think at a time in the world now where the masses, there are all kinds of masses who have all kinds of delusions, it is really, really important to sit grounded in our physical places, looking for whatever truth we can find in our own embodied state and our own relationships with what we might think of as the other world, or with a crow, or with a rock, or a river, or a tree. It's down to us to do the work rather than to have it all handed down. So that would be a key part of, to me, a practice for the contemporary world. Key feature, which I think can easily be done, and the next 2 or 3 things that I'm going to talk about kind of fall into this category or begin here, is an acknowledgement of other layers of reality, an acknowledgement that the physical and sensory world is incredibly important, incredibly important. We have to belong to it. We have to be embodied. We have to be open to our senses in a way that, you know, very often in the West we're not, frankly. But every Western tradition tells us that there is another world. There is an other world, at least one, maybe several. In the Norse tradition, there are 9, I think, 9 worlds that run alongside this, or that are unfolded with this. And that if we are not aware of that, and in some way attempting to engage with it, then we're not really properly alive. We're only, there is a big, big veil covering our vision, a big veil, and we need to pierce it. We need to find ways of piercing that veil so that we can see into this greater reality which all of our Western traditions tell us we are embedded in. So that is the question. How do we do that in a grounded and an authentic way? Well, I teach it, I guess, through practices that I bundle together in the terms of what I call the mythic imagination. And the practice of mythic imagination, which I teach, is premised on the fact that each of us has what I like to call our own unique inner imaginarium. So an imaginarium is kind of like, you know, in the real world, it's kind of like a place where there are a lot of images. It's like a museum for images. And I like to think that we will have an inner one, because each of us, every one of us, is haunted by different images, artworks, for example, pieces of music, poetry. Each of us resonates with different myths or fairy tales, and each of us resonates with particular archetypal characters within them. We're all different in that. The things that really, we read a poem or we read a story and some big mega light goes on inside us that we don't often even know why. Often that's a process of years of unfolding, which again is how it's supposed to be. That's part of the excitement. That's part of the journey. If we knew everything at once, life would be very dull. So we each have we each have this collection of beauty, which is a clue, which all of which together provides a clue as to who we meant to be in this life. It provides a clue about the nature of that unique gift that we bring to the world, that unique kind of mythopoetic, which means myth making, that unique myth making self. It's revealed in this inner imaginarium, just as it's revealed in the dreams we have and the characters and the themes which come to us in dreams, in our visionary journeys, whatever they may be, deep imagination journeys, guided imagination journeys, shamanic journeying, if that's what you do, in our special relationships with other than humans. Why is my imagination so captured by a crow and not another bird? You know, there's something in that. These particular things that just resonate with us for reasons we don't even know. And a lot of the work that I do is in helping people literally to compile that inner imaginarium, to compile that set of clues in various ways. And if there was an easy practice which I could leave with all of you today to go away and think about, it would be that. Just making a list, or if you're an artist, you know, drawing it, kind of, I don't know, collating. Here's a poem, here's an image, put it in a book, make your inner imaginarium book. Don't expect instant revelation. Write your dreams down, the big dreams, you know, what Jung called the big dreams, the ones that you know have some meaning. And I've had big dreams. I've known they were big at the time, and it might be 5 years later when I figured out what on earth was going on. That's fine too. Because the mistake that we make in all of this work is we try to define, and we try to, and by defining, by seeking to find immediate meaning, we confine as well. We restrict. We don't let the image or the poem work on us. And it's really important that if we have a particular image, we have a particular story, a particular character, a particular poem, a particular piece of art, that we sit with it and let it reveal itself to us, rather than blundering straight in and trying to confine and define it. That is work that everyone can do. And that helps us to develop our mythic imagination, you know, to look for these clues, to look for guidance, to look for patterns, to look for what the revelation is about us and what we are passionate about our calling, about our unique gift in the world. This is all about uncovering those deep mythopoetic patterns that are unique to every one of us. How do we bring them to life and let them work their magic on us? How do we unveil that guiding image which each soul brings into the world? So the practice of mythic imagination is about being open to and actively contemplating these images in whatever form they are, whether they're visual images or auditory images, or it doesn't matter. Images are in all senses. We're not just talking vision here. How do we actively contemplate those images which arise unbidden in our dreams or in stories, poems, and art? It's about kind of exploring the symbolic languages of the imagination, like the archetypal languages. Like tarot, for example, is a great way of doing this. It's kind of the basic tarot decks, particularly things like the Rider-Waite, are clearly they are culturally specific at some level, but they are fairly simple, archetypal, universal is the word I was struggling for. I told you it was late. Universal archetypal images that bear contemplating. Tarot is a great set of images. I don't mean for divination. I mean, obviously, tarot can be used for divination, but just as images, as archetypal images to contemplate. They were designed, all of those images in a tarot deck were designed to convey profoundly archetypal information. And just by contemplating them, you're exercising your mythic imagination. Stuff is happening at a level that you probably can't immediately discern. So again, yes, this is all of this work is about courting that world soul of ancient tradition, of which each individual soul is a part. So there is that work on the one hand. Again, I'm being very general here because of the time constraints. There's, on the one hand, there is that work on the imagination. On the other hand, the second major thread is what I guess I like to call rewilding the imagination. And that is a necessary and lifelong practice. And again, it happens through relationship with the world around us. Because again, those ancient spiritual traditions of ours tell us that we chose to incarnate into this physical world. It's literally the ground of our being. What Keats called the veil, John Keats, the British poet, called the veil of soul making. And the body is, our own personal physical body is so much a part of this as well. And I think of the body not as a vessel for our individual psyche, for our individual soul. I see it as a kind of soul mate. You know, the soul and the physical body are in this together, again, completely entwined, like the physical world and the other world, completely entwined. You can't extract them, otherwise they both die. And the body is so much a part of this as well. And that is what I kind of mean by rewilding the imagination, is that it's through acts of imagining in our places, imagining in our body from a very, very grounded, authentic, and placed way, that we keep ourselves straight, that we don't go off into some kind of la-la, airy-fairy, intellectual, transcendental space which has nothing to do with our physical incarnation here. So it's really about literally finding our mythic ground. It's about finding our place in this world, about learning the stories of the places where our feet are planted, whether we think we're going to be in those places forever or not, the places which give us life now. What are the archetypes which are alive in them? What are the folk tales and the fairy tales which happen there? Which archetypal characters inhabit them? What form does trickster take in your place? Is it a crow? Is it a coyote? This kind of question, where we bring these imaginal archetypal ideas into our places, so that, as I said, when I was at the Rose Center for the first time and found chipmunk for the first time, it's just like, what on earth is that? What is that? What is its story? What is its wisdom? It's stepping beyond the deep importance of knowing, the habitat and the nature of a creature, into that other layer, which is kind of, what else is it? What else is it as well? And that's bringing the imaginal into the physical in a perfectly entangled way, not separate anymore, but right down to earth. So that deepening of our relationship with place and of our imaginal engagement with place, it's kind of our own, it's like a map of our own individual ecopsychology, as at the very heart of my work within mythic imagination, because it does bring the imagination back down to earth. It keeps us honest. It keeps us here in our bodies where we were meant to be. It keeps us entangled in the web of life around us. And the one question I'm going to be doing, hopefully next year, a couple of online webinars with Ro on that, on this very subject, which is dear to my heart, which would be called A Psyche the Size of Earth. So yeah, do sign up to my newsletter to be kept informed of all of this. And the kind of question that I often put to people is, okay, so as someone who was raised in the Irish and Scottish traditions, particularly, I know what a crow is in that mythology. So a crow is the Morrigan, the crow goddess of Irish mythology. A crow is very serious. Is a crow carries the gifts of the other world. A crow is a little bit tricksterish. You don't mess with a crow. A crow is very intelligent. A crow has power. What am I in a crow's mythology? That's what I mean by reciprocity. We all focus on what crow means to us. What do I see, when I see crow? What does crow see when crow sees me? And what do I want crow to see when crow sees me? So that is an act of imagination. It's an act of the mythic imagination. It's an act of reciprocal mythic imagination to turn everything on its head so that it's not all about us. It's not all from our perspective, but it is about our embeddedness in a genuine web, not a pyramid where we're at the top looking how it all affects us, but a genuine web where we're bang in the middle of it, looking at how we affect everything else at the same time, and how our story interacts with the stories of the other creatures who inhabit the land around us. So, to finish what I wanted to say, I just wanted to share with you some ideas. In one of my online courses, Courting the World Soul, I offer this up as a kind of manifesto for courting the world soul, and I'd just like to share it with you, because it kind of encapsulates some of my ideas about what an authentic contemporary spirituality would look like. And at the beginning of that manifesto that I wrote for that course, I quoted from the German romantic poet Hölderlin. If you don't know Hölderlin, look him up. Robert Bly has some great translations of his work in a book whose name I can't remember, and I don't have it to hand, I don't think. No, I don't have it to hand. Anyway, Hölderlin, H-O with an umlaut, L-D-E-R-L-I-N. And Hölderlin says, "Behold, it is the eve of time, the hour when wanderers turn towards their resting place. One God after another is coming home. Therefore, be present." So I think that's kind of relevant for this crazy time that we find ourselves in. One God after another is coming home, therefore be present. And the one thing that I do say when I work with the mythic imagination is always, when you think what story you want to be living, when you focus on particular archetype stories, poems, images, whatever, when you are in your being in the world, we're all worshipping in some God's temple, whether we know it or not. And the question that I like to ask myself every day is, whose God's temple am I worshipping in today? Is that a good thing for the world and for me, or is that a bad thing? So I love that quote from Hölderlin because it seems to somehow encapsulate that. So how do we bring this kind of different new approach to spirituality and the emergence of maybe a different story, a different myth to live by than the one that is making our culture run away in such profoundly unhelpful ways? Not a new myth, an old myth, or a set of old myths, a set of old traditions, but that are brought back into the current day to be relevant to the times. I think that really that what I would call the great work of our time, I'm kind of stealing a phrase, the great work of our time, from Thomas Berry, very, very fine man who wrote The Dream of Earth. But my view today, life's moved on a bit since the decades in which Thomas wrote that very beautiful book. I believe that the great work of our time is to turn our attention to that long neglected imaginal world, to the world soul, to find ways of meaningfully engaging with it, because we don't know what we're doing just as humans. We have no idea. We clearly are flailing, and we need help, all of the help that we can get, whether it's from crows or from stories and myths, and what James Hillman, the founding father of archetypal psychology, beautifully called the necessary angels that inhabited the imaginal world. I love that idea of the soul guides, the psychopomps, what the Greek called psychopomps. Hillman called them the necessary angels. Beautiful phrase. I believe that we have to find ways to see through outer experiences and into the deeper mythic reality which lies beneath them, so that we can bring ourselves more deeply into alignment with the anima mundi and its unfolding, as well as helping us to understand our own soul's purpose and our unique soul gift. So that great work is about letting the imaginal world, letting the world to really get to work on us, working with the imagination. And I would suggest that it includes this little list. I'm going to try and copy and paste it into the chat. I don't know whether I can do that. Not quite sure how that works, because there's quite a lot of it. Let me see if I can do that. No. Okay, it didn't want me to do that. Maybe I'll do them one at a time. See if that works. Hold on. Oh, okay, that's because I'm trying to go to... Okay, I can't seem to find a way to share with everybody. I can only seem to share with Arthur, who isn't here privately. So many, oh, everyone in meeting. There we go. How does that work? Let me just try this here. Okay. Sorry about the formatting. It's just going to work that way. To feel that the whole world is our church, sacred, free of dogma and hierarchy, preaching love and engagement. Okay, engagement being a really critical thing, because we all, even though we feel that we have no power very often, and we feel that we're living a very passive existence, there are many, many, many ways to engage with the world, to participate in it. Participation, this beautiful old word, is about relationship and reciprocity. It's not about grand gestures. It is about relationship and reciprocity. So to me, that sense that we don't need specific places to, well, sacred places are important. I don't mean that, but the whole world is sacred. The whole world, everything in it, the whole web of life is sacred, and that we approach it free of dogma and hierarchy, engaging reciprocally. So that to me is kind of the starting point. Let's see what we can do here with the next bit. This is repeating something of what I have said. Paste. Okay, to understand that the end point, as I mentioned earlier on, is personal gnosis, personal knowledge, personal revelation, our own individual spiritual revelation, as well as respect for the diverse perspectives and revelations of others, because we all have our own way of being in the world. We all have our own way of uncovering knowledge. And part of the problem that dogma has got us into is an intolerance for other people's ways of knowing. One could argue that that led to the whole horror of the witch trials in the late medieval period. But again, that's a story for another course. That really, that respect, that tolerance, that sense of respecting our own intuition as well, skepticism and questioning always being a part of that. We have to question ourselves. We have to not be too quick to believe, too quick to accept, but nevertheless, that trusting in our own intuition, in our own inner knowing, is a very, very big part of it. The next bit, I'll try and copy and paste number 3. Okay. Oh, sorry. To understand that the entire cosmos is animate, again, coming from our oldest traditions throughout the West, that it wants to draw us into conversation and relationship. And this is something that's really important to stress. We think, we know that we need to be in relationship with the world around us in order to have a sense of belonging, in order to have a sense of purpose, in order to have a sense of meaning. But I believe very strongly that the world also needs us to be in relationship with it. This is a two-way street. And so we have that sense of responsibility, I believe. It's kind of like a moral obligation to a world that gives us life. It's not a one-way street. What does it need from us? It needs acknowledgement. A tree might like to have a poem said to it. A crow might like to have a song sung to it, if I'm just using silly examples. That sense of being in conversation in whatever way we can, even if we don't quite know what's going on, just the knowledge that we are attempting to make a connection. That sense that the world wants this of us. It's not just us that yearns for it, that the world also yearns for us to be in relationship with it. Okay, next one. To feel ourselves undertaking our own personal journeys of transformation and soul making, because again, go all the way back to Plato, this was critical. We came here with something to be or to do, both probably, with a gift, with a purpose. To find ourselves undertaking our own personal journeys of transformation and soul making within the context of a cosmos that has its own purpose and is itself continually evolving. Okay, so I've gone through that a couple of times. Now I'm not going to repeat it again. The next one. To respect the wisdom and the personal paths of becoming of the other than humans who share this world with us. So that's again stepping out of that human-centric perspective and an acknowledgement that in this great web, everything has a part, not just us. We're not at the top of any pyramid. We are in a web of nodes of other life, and we're all in it together. We're all entangled in it. And we're not the ones that make all the rules up. Next one is to understand that the sacred, the anima mundi, the world soul, is inside us and we are inside it. Again, this is this sense of entanglement. Psyche is in us. We talk about our own human souls. We are also in psyche. We're in the world soul. There's no separation. Okay, so that would be intrinsic to these old ideas too. Next one is to endeavor to grow our spirituality from ancient roots, but planted in the soil we are grounded in today. So that's this business of letting it grow, letting it become relevant for the times. To commit to fully engage in the act of soul making. To work on uncovering our soul's calling and that unique gift that we bring to the world at this time and in this place, because that, according to all the old traditions, that's really what it's all for. And, you know, again, there's a whole mega course on calling, but it doesn't matter when you find your calling. It's the journey, not the destination, if you'll forgive the cliche. It's not something you have to find at 20 and then think, I've got that now, I've done it. Many of us find our calling late in life, and without the many paths that we took that allowed us to get to that stage, we wouldn't have got to our calling. We wouldn't have the knowledge, we wouldn't have the wisdom to fully embody it in the world today. So it's not a race to any finish line. Calling is an iterative process. It goes on and on and on. Lisa, I just saw that. I think of it as dancing with a great mystery. Yes, that's a very, very beautiful way of putting it. Thank you. And finally, well, not really finally, but it's the only one that I have got here, is to, again, as I said, to find an ongoing practice of engaging with the imaginal and exploring the mythic currents that work in the river of our lives, becoming aware of the mythic and the archetypal in the everyday world. So again, that's a whole body of individual practices, which I can't possibly offer to you in a 2-hour slot today, but that sense of that work that I suggested with our own inner imaginariums, thinking about the stories which really move us at various times of our lives, and looking into our dreams and thinking about what the world, the other world, the imaginal world is trying to communicate with us, trying to get through our thick skulls, which I believe it is all of the time, finding ways to listen. So that's a very general manifesto for what I think is important that we can bring back from these ancient traditions as a kind of commitment to a way of being in the world today. They do, of course, follow on from that specific practices. I teach a lot. You probably have some of your own. And again, we don't have time to go into that. But I hope that I've sown some seeds for you to think about the kind of work that you might do that will help lead to that process of personal gnosis. So what I want to do now is just for the last few minutes to again offer you the opportunity to make any comments or to ask any questions before we hand back to Arthur. And I'm going to lump straight into there. Is the manifesto in any of my books? I'm afraid it is not, only in my courses. And I'm working on a way of making it more widely available, Nelly. Just won't be this day because there's always a lot to do. There's a lot of questions here, Arthur, and fear about whether the chat can be saved. So I don't know whether you can help with that at the end, maybe, in case people are missing the thread of the chat.
Yes, we can help you. At the bottom of the chat, you'll see an icon that says File. If you click on that, it'll tell you, you can tell it where you want to save the chat. It also comes as part of the recording link that I can make available to anyone that asks for it. Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was an upload or download button, so forgive me, I may have made a mistake. But if you send me an email at arthur@rosecenter.org afterwards, I'll send it to you when we get the recording for the chat. I mean, the recording that will include the chat.
Great, thank you very much. Hazel, oh, sorry, Arthur, I just want to take a few.
I was going to say, I posted on, for all of you, the link to register for Sharon's 4-part series, which is going to begin on Halloween on October 31st. It takes place over 4 sessions, 4 weekly sessions. Do you want to talk a little bit about the program, or do you want to save that for later?
I hadn't planned to, but basically what we're doing there is we are looking at, we're looking, well, it's on the website, but we're looking in some detail at kind of the history of the witch archetype and how in the very, very earliest days of the witch archetype, it was perceived to be a very, very negative and harmful archetype. The witch was the person who did bad magic to the community, and how that progressed into the witch trials a little bit of kind of like the truth, if you like, of the witch trials, which isn't always known, and then how, springing from that, all of a sudden the witch has become in many, many ways an inspiration, I think, for all of us. How did that happen? That's kind of an interesting like detective story in itself. But also, what are the different ways that the witch archetype today can inspire us to be in a world that really needs increasing feminine power and insight and wisdom? So yeah, I'm really looking forward to that one. It's one of my favorite subjects. So yeah, if you have any questions, then I'm sure Arthur will be happy about the technicalities. Arthur will be happy to answer them. Anne, am I speaking of the witch as the crone? I speak of the witch as relevant to all ages. I speak of different elements of the witch archetype that are relevant to us at all stages of our lives. And to me, that is the beauty of the witch archetype. It is not age specific. We can tap into it at any point. I don't want to say any more than that, because otherwise I'll give away the course, but that's basically what we're doing here. Does anybody have, just on time, my voice is giving up. Anybody has any questions? I'll see if I've got enough voice to answer them. Excuse me. Arthur, can you say something while I cough?
Sorry, I'm just looking at some of the questions that are going by. Here's a good one. If you were to come back as another entity, what would it be? I'll give you a little time to think and swallow.
Excuse me, I'm sorry about that. Tickle in my throat. If I were to come back as another entity. I have no idea. Absolutely no idea. Arthur, you always pick the difficult questions. What else have we got? Excuse me. There is a huge disconnect in the witch archetype, which means witchcraft has been appropriated as an aesthetic practice, which is in some ways harmful to the earth. Yeah, I agree with you, Alison. I think we'll get to that in that course and look at all of the positives and the negatives about how that archetype has shifted really over time. Thank you all for your kind comments. I'm really glad that you all enjoyed it. Looking for any questions? Lots of kind comments. How would I recommend that people reconnect with the stories of the land when those stories appear to be lost? I think by going out and interrogating the land. I think by going and sitting with a tree and allowing yourself to imagine what its story might be over the years that it's been alive, what it might have to tell, or a rock, the same with the rock, the same with the river, the same with the tree, to think of all of the archetypal characters that you know from, fairy stories and folktales that you've read, what seems to you intrinsically to belong there. There are many, many ways of sitting with the land and engaging with it mythically, looking for archetypes. I look for faces first, I look for faces and rocks, and I kind of start from there. That in itself is a whole other subject. And as I said earlier, I'm hoping that early next year, there will be a course entitled Psyche the Size of Earth, also with Rome, which will look in much more detail at some of these land-based practices that will help us find our stories, help us find our place, help us find that sense of belonging. And we can for sure go into more detail at that point. Okay, chat's moving really, really quickly. There was one there that I was going to answer and I've lost it now. Okay, specifically there. Malika, I think that is, when I say fate might be similar to the karma of the East, because we were talking earlier about fate as actually the great balancer, not as destiny, but as the thing that brings us back into balance and harmony with the earth and with the world. I think karma is a bit more personal. I mean, I know that karma can relate to various things. I think fate is, generally speaking, although everybody has their own kind of individual part to play in the world's balance, fate to me seems more kind of global, if you like, and karma seems a little bit more personal or ancestral line. But it has very many overlaps and very, very many similarities. And this idea of fate as the balancer, or kind of fate type characters as balancers, appears also in the Irish tradition, you know, when we have that wonderful old story of the marriage between the king and the land, you know, that the king marries the goddess of the land in order to commit to the people living in balance and harmony with the land. So that's in that sense that if that balance is broken, if the king or the people don't keep their promise, that there will be consequences. There will be a wasteland, or there will be a flood or an inundation. So to me, it is more of, it's a little bit more earthy, perhaps, than karma would be, but it's similar in principle. One more, and then let's close it down. I think Cornelia, can I speak to the difference between the mental imaginal engagement and the dropping of the mental to the felt experience and engagement? That's I suppose I see it in it depends. I think everybody deals with this differently depending on how and which specific practices that you do. But I would say that if you are doing something like a guided imagination journey, an active imagination journey, a shamanic journey, then that is probably more mental, in the sense that, you know, your body generally in these things is intended to be very, very relaxed, so it kind of doesn't get in the way. So by definition, you're trying to cut out physical and sensory signals and focus on what is happening in the space between you and the imaginal world. So that is the kind of thing that I would mean by that. Whereas the felt experience, the embodied experience and engagement would be if you went outside and you sat in front of a tree and you reached out to it, you kind of journeyed, if you like, towards the tree, very respectfully, asking permission. So working with something that is in your physical environment, if that makes sense, or engaging with your own body for healing. That is another kind of imaginal work, you know, journeying to a source of pain or discomfort, or to an organ of your body and having a conversation with it about what is going on there. That would be kind of more felt experience and engagement. So just a couple of little examples, which I hope might answer that for you. All right. Arthur, I think I'm about done. My voice is done for sure. And I'm going to cough and splutter if I talk some more. I think I've answered most of the big questions. And I really appreciate your engagement. And it's been great. It's great fun. Thank you. And thanks to Ro for hosting it.